Goedenavond, hartelijk dank om ook hier vanavond aanwezig te zijn op dit debat dat natuurlijk geopend wordt naar aanleiding van de tentoonstelling The State of Things. This exhibition, The State of Things, is opened here 2 days ago. We thought, and they thought, that something additional needed to be done in order to get really into the exhibition, into the show. It was necessary to talk about some questions that are obviously on the mind of many spectators that have visited already. The question is all about the relation between art and the market. We have therefore brought together 6 people who all have a specific experience that give them a particular point of view that might be of interest here. Colin Chinnery, he curated exhibitions to call one Sound in the City, and he combines in himself the best of 2 empires. Next to him is sitting Luc Tuymans. Luc doesn't need any presentation. As a matter of fact, everybody knows him here. Frank Uytterhaegen is a political scientist who arrived in China in the early 1970s, I believe, and in the 80s settled down there. He has some businesses, and most of all, he is a passionate collector of Chinese art. Li Jianhua is among the people around who is the most acquainted to the new media emerging in the Chinese landscape. Karen Smith is trained as an artist, and she is a close observer of the emerging Chinese art scene. Sus Van Elzen, his special interest for the major evolutions on the cultural level, the emerging of contemporary art scene led to a book, The Draak and the Rosentuin, on art and power in China, The Dragon and the Rose Garden. You brought up a very interesting idea that art scenes, development in art scenes, are often linked with urban situations.
The first time I saw Beijing was in 1976. A lot of the old things were still standing there, and later on, 1986, things were being demolished in horrifying, fast and brutal way. They had to do something with the city. They had to make a new city for a new man, for a new Chinese man, and it had to be a modern and contemporary. It had to be a luminous, brilliant city. So there they were with the old structure, and they decided quite fast to demolish it. After the revolution, that is in October 1949, Mao Zedong himself had, from the rostrum of Tiananmen itself, declared that what he wanted to see was very shortly a forest of factory chimneys as a skyline of Beijing. In fact, they quite literally did what Mao wanted, namely the building of the chimney, the factory chimney skyline. What they put up was a new city, but it was not along Chinese models, it was along Western models. Just as in the culture, in the art scene, they imported socialist realism from Europe, from the Soviet Union. If you go to 798, you see that everything is gone there. This was a gigantic factory. It was like a city. And it was the state of the art. It was very great. But after 20 years, it was almost empty. And at that moment, the Academy of Fine Arts of Beijing needed space. So they rented a space in this factory. The most important, or some of the most important contemporary Chinese artists were working there, living there. And that's why, if you wanted to have a look at contemporary Chinese art, that's where you went.
The decade, I think, is really an exciting one because it begins with a bang in 1989 with the first survey of Chinese art that was at the National Museum of Fine Arts, which we now know as NAMO. which was where a woman artist fired a live gun into her work. And it ends around like 2001, really with China joining WTO and a boom that then becomes this incredible consumer society that is consuming the urban centers in China. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, the development of the art scene is very much dictated by what was happening with the city, because even as 1989 June 4th was unfolding, artists even then were beginning to look for independent spaces to live. And they were moving to these small little villages, if you like, that were on the edge of the urban centers and the rural centers. A lot of artists in the 80s had believed that they were participating in this modernization of China, and it was only really towards the end of the 80s when Wei Jingshen started asking for this fifth modernization, which was the modernization of culture. And then, of course, you have the students demonstrating for this idea of democracy, which was then curtailed with June 4th. So actually, for the art scene, it was a very much like a eureka moment. So in the early 80s, there was a real influx of art magazines and catalogues, although it began with things that were fairly conservative, like Picasso, Matisse. But towards the end of the 80s, maybe a lot of people don't realize just how liberal from 85 to 89 was really quite a liberal period, partly because the government was focused on economics. So the 90s then became a polarizing sort of experience, because artists realized that suddenly there was an official art and that there was modern art which was beyond the bounds of anything that was described as official. So then it was very useful in mapping out the parameters of what was official. Thereby they could explore everything beyond those realms.
Nowadays art in China is very much dominated by the marketplace.
When an artist is successful in China and is a Chinese artist, it's good for their identity. And it's also good for their cultural industry. When an artist is famous here, it's much more suspect. I mean, it's much more an individual level.
Why is it suspect? How do you feel that? How would you
well,
describe
because
it?
there and then, because coming from a Christian background, and a great deal of the Western world comes out of a Christian background, there is the element of guilt. And there's also the element, which is played out also on economical levels before and in history and whatever. But it's also because, the artist is validated completely differently. Now the artist, the contemporary artist, is validated again differently. Before, they were looked upon as nutcases, basically. But through the fact that it's now worth a lot of money, ordinary people actually start to look at it a little bit more with an amused tone. I mean, they take it differently.
What China's been going through is very much comes out of a struggle between internal and external controls. And that is after the revolution. I mean, rather, the revolution in China in 1949, it closed the doors on China. I mean, China's history is all about being open and closed and open and closed. And China's still going through that process now.
The market is a very unstable thing, I would say so, in China. Or
the art market in itself is a very new phenomenon. If we talk about the 80s, the art market didn't exist in China, not in ancient times, not in classical times, and certainly not in the 20th century. There was no art market. The classical art was produced, painting was produced between an elite, which transferred each other to each other, which used it in an inner circle or in the imperial context, but not as a market as such. So galleries in China is an absolute new phenomenon. The first galleries on avant-garde art or contemporary art came up only at the end of, in the beginning of the 90s even, and there was no context in the infrastructure-wise, but there's, of course, also no context in what does an artwork cost. Who was going to determine that? Who was going to say, okay, that painting, that must go for so much? There was no market, there was no buyer, there was no seller. That's certainly one element, because the first art market was complete in the hands of the foreigners. Now, it's not the government who is taking that art market in hand. It is the private world.
For example, before 1989, Fan Dian was the member of all these free kind of organizations of the art group and stuff. And then later on, somehow he involved in the system that we also believe that he would help to change the system
So would you say that the system then is something that creates its own tyranny in itself?
Yeah, I think the system created, like, that's also need a little bit more of explanation, that how the system created, how that system created, like, dominating culture in a way that the system were developed as a propaganda system. That was the culture always under the propaganda system. Then I think right now, slowly that kind of thing are changing because of the more professional people involved in the cultural system, rather than in the political system, because everybody considers that Fan Dian is still a political figure, but in a way he is that because he's a political identity, but that doesn't mean that the role are certainly that important in a way.
Yeah. Perhaps we have to mention here that Fan Dian is the director of the Namok Museum, National Museum of Beijing.
Can
Karen,
I just give an example? Because
yes.
I think what Li Jianhua is describing is a highly sophisticated method of co-opting people. We might take an obvious example of the theatre director, film director Zhang Yimou, who has now been bought into doing all of these grand national productions and become almost like the spokesperson for the very system that actually his films were considered to be subversive against. And we see this with now the art schools sometimes bringing very important avant-garde artists who were important in the 80s and 90s, bringing them back to be heads of department within the schools. And, they were part of an idealistic generation that did believe that they would change China. And once they're back in the system, they very much have to put their own avant-garde identity aside. And I think this has quite an impact on the work that they produce and the voice with which they speak.
Ik denk dat het samenvallen van een economische bloei met een intellectuele vrijheid zeldzame momenten zijn in de geschiedenis van een land.
It's interesting. It's interesting, kind of. I would say interesting context between the debate and the exhibition, which is like what Luc said. I mean, the show is just selected a choice of choice. I really like the word because it's like there are no certain definition of the exhibition, which is like there are no certain way of tells you that what Chinese art should be, but there's Chinese art there as the fact. Then I would like to ask people actually to keep their question in mind.
Ik denk dat er heel veel interessante informatie uitgekomen is die de bezoekers van de tentoonstelling ook de gelegenheid geven om op een betere en meer gedocumenteerde en interessante manier de tentoonstelling te bekijken. Dus alles bij elkaar was fijn. Ja.